Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, your retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at a classic. It's been a while since I've looked at a classic. I think the last one was either Wizard of Oz or Anne of Avonlea, or Anne of Green Gables. But we're going to look at an old classic. This is an older classic. We're going to look at this one. This is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is one of my favorite books. Frankly, one of my favorite classics. It's a children's classic. It's a very interesting little book. Now, please be aware that this book was written, let's see if I remember the turn of the bloody century. Let's see, when was this book actually published? In the book. Anyone tell me when the book was actually published? Probably not. Sometime in the 1800s. It was first published in 1911, so please keep that in mind when we talk about the beginning of this book. So the first part of the story is of Mary Lennox. Now, Mary was born and raised in India. Essentially, her mother did not want her. She was a wealthy woman. She was married to a British government officer, so he wasn't military. He had a cushy government job in India, and he was busy. And she was off gallivanting around, going to parties, flirting with people, and she ended up having a little girl that she did not want. And she turned this little girl over to the servants and said, "I don't want to know she exists." And so 10 years passed. And Mary Lennox is a spoiled little girl, because the servants did not want her to cry or fuss or do anything, so they did whatever she said. She was never told no. Basically, she got whatever the heck she wanted. She had nothing to do with her parents. I mean, her father was always working. Her mother didn't want her to know she exists. She knew her parents existed. She'd seen them. She didn't interact with any other children. They tried to get apparently some governesses in, but once again, she's a spoiled little brat. And essentially they left because they couldn't handle her. And she did eventually teach herself to learn to read and write because she's so pleased. But otherwise, again, she was waited on hand and foot. She was dressed. I don't think they actually fed her, but essentially she did whatever she wanted. And the servants were afraid of her because they didn't want to piss off their mistress by, upsetting their child, which again the mistress didn't want to know existed. So that's Mary Lennox. At the beginning of the story, she's about 10 years old, and one day she gets up and her normal nurse isn't there, and she has a fit, but the servant who's there to dress her can't do anything. It's like she cannot come, and then she starts hearing things, and she's kind of eventually left alone in the garden by herself. And she sees her mother come out on the veranda with a young military officer, and they talk about cholera. So the cholera, which is a legitimate disease, it does kill. And it was spreading. And at one point in time when she's hearing this, how the mother wishes that she stayed behind to go to some party, and she wished they had left like a week ago. And then there's all sorts of crying going on, and it turns out that Mary's nurse, her Aya, had just died, and the mistress didn't. Mary's mother, Mrs. Lennox, didn't know that it had broken out among her servants. So Mary kind of knows what's going on. She now realizes that there's some sort of disease. She doesn't fully comprehend that it's killing people. It doesn't really matter. So she kind of goes about her day. She's pretty much left alone. The next day, the nurse comes, someone dresses her, and then she's again left alone completely. And she comes out of her nursery. She sees a dinner set out, and people had left. So she eats some of the food. She drinks some of the wine. The important thing. Goes back to her room because the wine she literally drinks an entire glass of wine. She's 10 years old. And she goes back to her room and goes to bed and goes to sleep. When she wakes up, the house is completely quiet. More quiet than she's ever realized, than it's ever been. There's no talking, there's no footsteps, there's nothing. She sees a snake appear, and it kind of scrolls out, and then she hears voices on the veranda. And they come basically real talking about how people have died and how the servants run away and that the place is completely deserted and how her mother is dead. And then it's like, what happened to the little girl? It's like, wasn't there a little girl? And they open the door, and there she's standing there, this 10-year-old that's been completely forgotten and how since her parents are dead. And she's been abandoned. And they're like, oh dear, there's a 10-year-old girl who's completely orphaned. We have to do something with her. And that's what she finds out. She doesn't cry for her parents because she didn't know them. She doesn't cry for anybody because she's a selfish little girl because she's never been raised to be anything else. So she's then sent to stay with a minister and his family who she hates because they're poor. And she's not used to being around other children. So they're obnoxious to her and she doesn't know how to react around them. And then she's sent off with an officer's wife and her 2 children to England, where she has an uncle, Archibald Craven. This is her father and Archibald's late wife were siblings. So he's the only family she has. So she goes off to England with this. They put her in care of this woman who doesn't really care she exists, who's paying more attention to her own children, who she's taking off to boarding school. And they arrive in England. She turns her over to Miss Medlock, who is his housekeeper, who strangely enough does not want to be there because she's missing out on her, I believe, her granddaughter's wedding. So yeah, I believe she's a widow. Doesn't mention she has a husband, but I believe she's older. So Medlock takes her, I think they have to spend the night and then in London, and then they take a train and go to Yorkshire, and then off into the middle of the moor, where you go to Misselthwaite. That is basically her home. She does not see her uncle for a while. She's left to her own devices. She's introduced to Martha. She's given a pair of rooms. Martha is a servant who kind of helps her learn how to dress herself and learn to go about her own business, because nobody's going to really pay attention to her here. Her uncle intends to give her a governess at some point, but he's depressed, he's a widowed, and he's constantly leaving. And he's just a queer man with kind of a hunched over shoulders. So she goes about, she hears about this garden that had belonged to her aunt and how it's been locked up. And she eventually, through the help of a robin, finds the key and gets in. And with the help of Martha and her brother Dickon, start kind of bringing this garden back to life. And she starts changing. She starts becoming happy and putting on weight. And she goes from being a sickly looking, grouchy little girl to being this happy child and normal, at least for an upper class little white girl in Victorian, this is 1911, Edwardian England, not Victorian, wrong century. So, here she is, yawning. So she starts changing, which is kind of the point. Medlock doesn't care. Miss Medlock is not paying attention as long as Mary stays out of the way. She does get in trouble once because on a rainy day she decides to wander through the house by herself. She does believe, I think she finds her aunt's dressing room and starts kind of nosing around. She plays with these little elephants, and she goes, and then at one point in time she decides to go looking for the library, and she gets caught by Medlock because she's hearing crying. That's the end part of the story. So eventually, it rains. She follows in the middle of the night to the sound of this crying, and she finds a little boy. It's her cousin, Colin. They're the same age. He's 10. He thinks he's going to die. He's a sickly boy who cannot walk because technically he chooses to. And he does tell her that they had brought a specialist down from England because he was wearing a back brace. And the specialist from England pretty much said he's a spoiled brat. Take that off. He doesn't have a hunch in his back. He should spend some more time outside and, not being waited on hand and foot because he's perfectly healthy. He's just a spoiled little brat. So Mary interacts with Colin. Again, he's a spoiled little brat, just like she was. Because again, they both isolated, didn't interact with any other children, and people did pretty much whatever they said. So they kind of start talking, and it's found out that basically his nurse and the doctor, who's actually his father's cousin, who if Colin dies, he would inherit. And he's a poorer man. He's a doctor. And Medlock. And they all find out, and they can't do anything. The nurse is actually quite happy. She doesn't care one way or the other. They're under the impression that she doesn't care whether Colin lives or dies. He's irritating. She's being paid. That's essentially it. And she's actually quite happy at one point in time when he throws a fit because Mary goes to see Dickon one morning and isn't there. And he throws a temper tantrum. And she shows up and she tells him off. Essentially, she's like, they can drag me here. You can make them do that, but I don't have to talk to you. I don't even have to look at you. The nurse thinks this is a good thing. It's like all of a sudden he has somebody who he can't order around. Because again, while he may be the heir, she's of his same class. She's his cousin. So he can't exactly order her around, and she has her own free will. She's not a servant. So this is good for him. He's finally getting a taste of his own medicine and not being given his way. So it's kind of interesting. I will put the book down. But they start becoming friends, and he decides to convince eventually Mary to take him outside. And they go outside and they go into the garden. And eventually they run into Ben Witherstaff. Now he's an under gardener who was close with Lilith, Colin's mother. And she made him promise to look after her roses, which is what's in the garden. And so he'd been climbing over the wall until arthritis pretty much stopped him. So he comes in. He's like, what the heck are you doing in here? And Colin basically is gourded into standing. And he realizes, like, I can be healthy. I'm normal. Because Mary's actually felt his back. It's like, you are not a hunchback. You're not going to die. You're just irritating. And so he starts learning to walk. And they start eating better. But he doesn't want anybody at the house to know. Because he doesn't want them writing his father. He wants to reveal his being able to walk to his father himself. So he starts to get healthier. You have the help of Dickon. You have the help of Susan Sutherland. I'm mispronouncing it. Dickon's mother. Dickon Martha's mother, who actually had gone to school with Mrs. Medlock when they were young. So she'd approached Archibald Craven on the road to mention Mary once, and then she actually writes to him later in the book. She helps them. She brings them food when they have to turn food away because they're trying to hide the fact that they're both putting on weight, and they're getting healthier because they don't want the house to know yet. So he starts being able to walk and laugh and run, and he becomes a perfectly healthy boy. And Dickon's mother writes Archibald Craven, who is I think he's in Norway. And he's been having dreams about his wife. And he's been starting to think that maybe he should go home and, actually be a father to his child. I believe his wife, she died in childbirth. She fell or she died, and she died in childbirth. So he gets this letter saying that, from Dickon's mother, saying that, I think you should come home. I think your wife would have wanted you to come home. So he comes home. And he's like, where's my kid? What's going on? They're like, we don't know. The house people do not know. It's like he's queer. He started getting weight. He was eating his food. Then he started sending me away. And yet he's outside all day. And they don't know. So he goes out to find the garden. And I think they're playing a game of blind man's bluff. So Colin is blindfolded. And he's searching for Mary and Dickon, and he runs into his father, and his father stares at him. It's like, and Colin takes his mask off, it's like he realizes he's looking at his dad. And he starts talking really fast, and his father's seriously staring. It's like, the sickly, spoiled boy is perfectly happy, standing here straight, completely straight, not hunched over, a perfectly normal boy. And then he's like, take me into the garden. And so he takes him to the garden and tells the entire story of the magic and Mary and the gardens. And then he says, we can walk back to the house. I'm never getting in that chair again. And that's how the book ends. It basically, Witherstaff can come to the house to get a beer, which he rarely does. And he knows all this is going on. He's like, I hang out and going to watch and see how the house servants react to the fact that the spoiled, sickly little boy is anything but. And that's basically they're staring. Because him and his father come walking back up, and he's a perfectly normal, healthy young boy, about 10 years old. And that's how the book ends. So this is an interesting story in the fact that there's no villain. That's one of the things that you don't find. I'll cover the film. There is no villain in this book at all. Medlock, the nurse, the doctor are confused. They try a little bit to tell Colin what to do, but they don't force anything on him. They're not evil. Medlock's just trying to do her job. She mostly ignores Mary. Mary gets in trouble with her maybe once. They don't try to control Mary's interactions with Colin. Once she finds out he's there, the cat's out of the bag. Even Dickon knows Colin exists, because obviously it's a small village. They know he exists. So, but when she finds out, I mean, the cat's out of the bag and nobody cares. If she screams and yells at him, his nurse does not care. In fact, she's perfectly happy. Again, it's very much implied that she doesn't care where Colin lives or dies. She's employed. She takes care of him. She does what he wants. She moves on with her life. She neither likes nor hates him. He's just a nuisance. He's just her job. So if he dies, she does not care at all. So, and especially the servants don't. They're not paying that much attention, though they have a little bit more of a stake in it. And neither does Dr. Craven. I mean, it's never implied that he's evil. I mean, he thinks some strange stuff is going on, but they don't interfere at all. So there is no legitimate villain in this story except for the children themselves. And that's the thing. There's a little quote in there. It's like, this isn't a hidden thing. This makes it perfectly clear that when it says Mary, when she was thinking of horrid things and was spoiled and disliking people and had dark thoughts and just was a miserable girl, once she started thinking about gardens and small animals and Yorkshire boys and all sorts of things, she became healthy. Her hair became thick. She lost the yellowness. Her stomach stopped hurting. She became a perfectly healthy, beautiful young girl. Same thing happened to Colin. Once he stopped thinking about death and being miserable and not being able to walk and started thinking about Mary and gardens and magic and science and all sorts of things, he became a perfectly healthy young boy who could walk and run and laugh and be normal. And there's a simple quote in there, "Where you tend a rose, my lad, a thistle cannot grow." So essentially, if you think bad thoughts, you're going to be unhealthy and unhappy. If you think good thoughts, you're going to get better. This is simplistic, but again, these are wealthy children in like Victorian Edwardian England. So they don't have anything to worry about, really. I mean, Colin's going to inherit Mistleswade. I'm pretty sure Mary inherited something from both of her parents were wealthy, and she's their only heir. So they have nothing to worry about in this case. And most of their issues, again, were by bad thoughts because they were miserable and alone. A big thing. Again, both of these children were waited on hand and foot by servants who never dared disobey them. So once they started interacting with each other, in the case of Mary, the staff at Mistleswade were not interested in spoiling her whatsoever. They had to deal with Colin. And, Archibald Craven, who, whenever he was there, essentially he was tended to by his old servant who's been somebody who's been with him his entire life. Like, sorry, yawning. I have a small child who woke me up at 4 in the morning. Because I have a small child. And that's what they do. But that is essentially the basis of this story, is it's the idea of, if you think negative things, you're going to be miserable. And if you think positive things, things will be better and you embrace different things. Probably a good message we should all have. Sorry. So that is the basis of the story. It's a very, very good book. It's a good read aloud book. It has a great message. So the only questionable stuff, again, is the native servants. They're not exactly portrayed badly. I mean, Mary's a spoiled brat and they don't want to piss off their employer, similar to the servants at Misselthwaite. So, and it's a sign of the books of the time, and British imperialism, and it happens really quickly. I mean, literally, she's in India for a chapter. You do not see her father. Her father is barely mentioned. Her mother is in one scene, and that is it. And then you're in England, dealing with more ponies and gardens and growing children and magic and all sorts of things. It's an enjoyable little story, particularly if you like gardens and old children's stories. Definitely a read aloud. I'm trying to think of age range. Mid-elementary, depending on your reading level. I am terribly sorry about yawning, but it's 9 at night and I have a toddler who woke me up before the morning. So let's wrap this up. Again, middle school or late elementary reading wise, you can read it to any age. There's nothing outward, horrible, or scary remotely in this book. It's really about two children growing into themselves and ceasing to be depressed, because they were spoiled brats and they needed something to live for that was not, and people, not to do whatever they say constantly, give them some sort of challenge. And Mary had to learn to be nice because Dickon wasn't going to, he was going to be a spoiled brat. He didn't have to have anything to do with her. So, and the same with Mary and Colin. She didn't have to have anything to do with him, so they had to work on, interpersonal relationships. So, fantastic story for pretty much any age. Good read-aloud book. And that's really about it. I highly recommend The Secret Garden. This is my copy. I don't think it's under copyright anymore. I really don't. You can find it almost anywhere. So, that is it for this review. If you like what you see, like and subscribe. I have a lot of various book reviews, both classics and more modern stuff, and anything and everything in between, along with films. I will be covering the 1993 film, and I may cover some of the more recent stuff. I have not seen them. I own the 1993 film, so that's what I'm going to cover right now. We'll see. I may throw in a few other videos if I can manage to watch the newer versions. So that is it. Again, like and subscribe. Check out what I got. Thank you.